Hello, I'm Michael.
And I'm Tim.
We'd like to talk to you about the Voice to Parliament. In this YouTube video series, we're going to be addressing some of the common misleading sound bites you may have heard in the lead up to the referendum on the Voice to Parliament.
Don't you just hate sound bites?
I do. But what I hate even more are misleading sound bites, sometimes deliberately misleading. Many people are so busy, all they have time to absorb are sound bites. And if many of the sound bites they hear about the Voice to Parliament are misleading, or at the very least lacking in a lot of information, then they'll be voting at the referendum based on this misleading or incomplete information.
Maybe we'd better do something about it.
I reckon. That's what we're going to attempt in this video series. We're going to address commonly raised objections to the voice, which might sound reasonable on the surface, but when inspected more closely, they look very different indeed.
Wherever we can, we're going to provide you with references that you can check out yourself. With this referendum, we need to critically examine claims. We need to fact-check assertions rather than simply swallowing what we're told.
Let's start with the indisputable fact.
Later this year, we will be called to vote in a referendum to change the Constitution of Australia.
We'll be asked a simple question. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? The constitutional amendment we'll be voting on to add a new section, Section 129 to the Constitution, looks like this. It begins this way: with a recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. And the way in which this recognition occurs is covered in the three clauses of the amendment. Clause 1 states that a body will be created called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. As to the functions and workings of this body called the Voice, this is covered in Clause 3. It is the Parliament which shall have power to make laws about how the voice will work, its composition, functions, powers and procedures. As for the body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, this is covered in Clause 2. It may make representations to the government on matters relating to Indigenous peoples. The key distinction here: the Parliament has the power and the voice has the right to make representations. That is what we'll be voting on at the referendum later this year. With that covered, on to our first common objection to the Voice to Parliament.
You're still forgetting something.
What?
You've just told people what the Voice to Parliament is, but why do so many people argue we need an Indigenous voice to Parliament?
Okay, the argument for the voice in 60 seconds. Start the clock. First, to recognise in the Constitution Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples is simply acknowledging reality, as well as honouring 65,000 years of Indigenous culture. Second, how we make the recognition meaningful is by honouring the call from the Uluru Statement for a First Nations voice. Third, once again to state reality, there is a massive gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in areas such as health, life expectancy and socio-economic status. Fourth, many well-meaning attempts have been made and billions spent every year to close this gap, But overall, these efforts just haven't worked. Fifth and finally, it is hoped that The Voice, by providing grassroots advice to government, will help to improve practical outcomes for Indigenous people to help close the gap. That's the argument for The Voice in a nutshell. Okay, it's time to look at our first common misleading soundbite. Common soundbite number 1. But we don't have any details about how The Voice would work. This is an argument against The Voice raised by a number of people, foremost among them the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton.
The opposition leader voices his concerns, demanding detail on the Prime Minister's plan for a change to our Constitution.
I think he's treating the public, frankly, like mugs at the moment.
The public will have their say on an Indigenous voice to Parliament in a referendum as early as August. Peter Dutton arguing they don't yet know what they're voting for.
By starving the Australian people of the basic detail about The Voice, the Prime Minister is really setting The Voice up for a fail.
The Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, looks in a pensive mood. I wonder what he's thinking. I feel like I've forgotten something. No, don't tell me. It's on the tip of my tongue. Ah, that's right. Now I remember. I was part of the coalition government that commissioned the Indigenous Voice Co-Design Senior Advisory Group, and which provided the coalition government, of which I was part, with lots and lots of details on how a voice might operate.
Okay.
Yes, you heard it right. The Leader of the Opposition, who claims to have no details on how the voice to Parliament might operate, was part of the coalition government which commissioned and received an immensely detailed report on how the voice to Parliament might operate. In November 2019, Ken Wyatt, then Minister for Indigenous Australians in the coalition government, announced in a press release the formation of the Voice Co-Design Senior Advisory Group. A number of Australians will help guide the co-design process to develop options for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The Senior Advisory Group will advise me on options for models that will ensure that Indigenous Australians are heard at all levels of government, local, state and federal. The Indigenous Voice Co-Design Senior Advisory Group, commissioned by the Coalition Government, chaired by Professors Tom Calmer and Marcia Langton, comprised 19 members, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Over a period of 18 months, the Senior Advisory Group did an enormous amount of work. They conducted over 100 community consultation sessions, another 40 additional sessions, over 100 stakeholder meetings involving some 1,200 people, 1,300 webinars with 1,500 attendees, nearly 3,000 submissions received. More than 9,000 people and organisations participated in the consultation and engagement process. At the end of the Indigenous Voice Co-Design consultation process, the final report was presented to the Coalition Government in July 2021. You would imagine that such a report would have a lot of information in it about how voice to Parliament might work. And a lot of information indeed it has. Information about how local, regional and national voice bodies would integrate and work together, how membership of the various bodies might be organised, how governance structures for these bodies could be organised, how the various bodies would interface potentially with existing Indigenous and non-Indigenous organisations, and how dispute resolution might be achieved. Now, at this stage, if you're thinking that you'd like more details about how an Indigenous voice to Parliament and executive government might work, you can download the final report to the coalition government. But if you do download the report, and if you do choose to print out that report, can I suggest that you put extra paper in the printer? Because the final report about how the voice might operate, this report given to the coalition government, is 272 pages in length. I can't help thinking of the opposition leader Peter Dutton's call for detail on the voice to Parliament as I flipped through the Indigenous voice co-design process final report commissioned and received by the coalition government of which Peter Dutton was part. And as I do, I can't help but think that this is really, I'm searching for the word, really detailed.
Yes, if you're used to a diet of sound bites, this detailed report is bound to give anyone a bad case of indigestion. I guess, to be fair to the Leader of the Opposition, as detailed as the Indigenous Voice co-design report given to the Coalition is, it doesn't describe how the voice will actually operate. It's a fantastic and incredibly detailed start, but after the referendum, if it's successful, Parliament will need to take this report, work out what to keep, what to change, what to add, and draft the legislation to enact the voice.
But Tim, maybe Peter Dutton's right. Surely the Australian public should be told before the referendum the actual details of how the voice will operate. Surely the Australian public should be able to see the detailed workings of the final way that the voice will operate and the detailed legislation, the final legislation before the referendum.
Does the Australian public really want all the details about how the voice will work? Do you really want all the details about how the voice will work?
Darling, I'm so excited. The Prime Minister has finally released the full details of the voice, exactly how the voice to Parliament will work, the full details of the legislation. It's going to be a long night for me and a long night for all Australians. How exciting! When's the last time you read a 272-page government report? When's the last time you read a piece of detailed government legislation? I can't speak for you, I can only speak for myself. But if between now and when we vote at the referendum, I had to read how the voice would work in all its detail and had to read the detailed legislation behind it? Just kill me now.
I think killing you would be an overreaction. But I take your point. The whole argument about needing more detail about the voice to Parliament is a red herring. The Australian public isn't in a million years going to sit down and read the detailed workings of the voice, including detailed legislation, even if it was available. We don't have the available time or the capacity or the interest to assimilate and process such a vast amount of information. Even if this information were available to us, we would be reliant upon those we trust to summarise that information for us. And as we've seen, not all those summaries and soundbites are actually trustworthy.
So, Tim, would it be fair to say that in summary, when it comes to the details about how voice to Parliament will operate, we can say that the constitutional amendment we are voting on at the referendum will establish not details, but broad principles about how the voice will operate. That an immense amount of detail about how the voice might operate has already been produced by the Indigenous Voice Co-Design Group. And that after the referendum, if it's successful, Parliament will have the power and the responsibility to work through those details and decide upon the actual structure and operation of the voice. That's their job.
Yes, working through the details is what we pay our parliamentarians for. I say we vote yes at the referendum and then let the parliamentarians get on with their job. And as the parliamentarians get on with their job, let's all hope that the voice to Parliament ends up making a significant difference in the lives of Indigenous Australians.
This episode number 1 video has focused on debunking the claim by opponents of the voice to Parliament that we have no details about how the voice might operate. Hopefully we've given you a feel for how sound bites like this, while they might sound reasonable on the surface, are extremely misleading in reality.
The amount of information in this voice referendum space is simply overwhelming. If you want to get more of a feel for just how much information you are missing out on in our soundbite saturated culture, you may wish to check out the voice discussion paper at the link below and in the details for this YouTube clip. Don't be put off by 29 pages. 7 pages of these are references. 2.5 pages are timeline details that you can just skim through and refer back to if necessary. The rest of the document is actually an easy read.
Thank you for joining us for episode 1. In episode 2, we take up the thorny topic of race. See you then.